The terrifying thing about a ghost story is not the specter itself, but the absence it represents. The gaping hole where a life used to be. But what about the stories that never even had a life? The voids in history that swallowed not just lives, but the very words that define them. We talk about horror in books, but true terror lives in the silence where those books should be. In this video, we don't look at the monstrous imaginations that were preserved. We dive into the profound, unsettling darkness of the works that vanished, the manuscripts that burned, the voices that were silenced, leaving behind only shadows and chilling rumors of the existential dread they contained. This is the literature that was too terrifying, too scandalous, or simply too unfortunate to survive. Number 1. The Lighthouse, the final nightmare of Edgar Allan Poe. We begin with the man who invented American darkness, Edgar Allan Poe. Poe knew fear. He lived in the shadow of consumption, poverty, and profound loss. His stories are precise mechanisms of dread. They trap you in tight spaces, bury you alive, or force you to listen to a beating heart beneath the floorboards. But Poe's final work, the one that should have sealed his legacy, was lost, leaving behind only the most fragmentary, chilling outline, The Lighthouse. In the final year of his life, 1849, Poe was preparing to embark on what promised to be his ultimate expression of solitary madness. He was obsessed with the idea of a psychological novel, a long-form work that would strip away the sensationalism and delve deep into the slow, quiet disintegration of a single mind. The premise was simple and claustrophobic. A lighthouse keeper, completely alone, maintaining his station against the infinite hostility of the sea and the sky. Poe only completed the first 2 pages. What survives is a journal entry written by the keeper on his first night. It's not dramatic. It's clinical. He meticulously describes his surroundings, the rotation of the light, the damp smell of the stone. But the narration is laced with a chilling, self-aware formality. He writes with the terrifying precision of a man trying desperately to maintain order in a world rapidly falling apart. He tells us he has deliberately stocked the lighthouse with enough provisions for months, and crucially, enough books. This literary detail is the key to the horror. Poe, the supreme literary craftsman, places his protagonist in a situation where the only company is his own mind, mediated through the structured narratives of literature. The plan for the novel, whispered among literary scholars, suggests a slow descent. The keeper's journal entries were supposed to become increasingly unreliable, the structure of his language mirroring the breakdown of his sanity. The books he brought for comfort, the foundations of civilization and logic, would begin to fail him. He would start seeing things in the storm-lashed glass, hearing sounds in the infinite repetition of the sea, mistaking the crashing waves for human voices or the knocking of the long dead. The true terror of The Lighthouse lies in its absence. What was the climax? Did the keeper realize the monster wasn't the sea or the storm, but the terrible, empty vacuum inside his own head? Did he become the light, guiding ships to destruction, or did the light fail entirely, plunging him and the world into darkness? Poe never finished it. He died mysteriously in Baltimore, found delirious on the street, uttering the name Reynolds before his final moments. His last artistic thought was this intense, unflinching look at solitary annihilation, and the manuscript, like his final days, simply evaporated into the dark air, leaving us to wonder if the truth was simply too bleak, too pure a horror for him, or us to bear. The loss of the lighthouse is the loss of Poe's final confession, a perfect, terrifying echo of his own life, cut short by unknown circumstances. It remains literature's great unfinished scream. Number 2. Lord Byron's Memoirs, the scandalous inferno. Now we turn from the horror of the internal abyss to the sheer terror of public exposure and scandal. George Gordon, Lord Byron, was not just a poet. He was a phenomenon, the original celebrity rock star of the 19th century. He was handsome, melancholic, wildly talented and utterly scandalous. His life was a torrent of debt, duels, drinking, and devastating love affairs. His poems, like Don Juan and Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, redefined Romanticism and captivated Europe. But his most dangerous work was his autobiography. Byron wrote his memoirs during his voluntary exile in Italy, chronicling his life with brutal, unsparing honesty. This was not a sanitized history for public consumption. It was a raw, witty, and profoundly shocking testament detailing everything: his tempestuous marriage, his bisexuality, his atheism, and critically, the rumored incestuous relationship with his half-sister, Augusta Leigh. He detailed the hypocrisy of English society, the true motives of his friends, and the sordid realities hidden beneath the veneer of aristocracy. The manuscript was huge, bound in 4 red leather volumes. Byron considered it his masterpiece of truth. He didn't write for fame. He already had it. He wrote to confess, to shock, and to settle scores from beyond the grave. He handed the sole copy over to his friend, the poet Thomas Moore, for safekeeping, instructing him that it should be published only after his death. In 1824, Byron died suddenly in Greece, fighting for their independence. When the news reached London, the literary and social world exploded. The publication of the Memoirs was imminent. But a select, horrified group of his closest friends and executors, including Thomas Moore, the publisher John Murray, and Byron's own half-sister Augusta, convened a private meeting in John Murray's drawing room. They had read the Memoirs, and what they saw terrified them. They realized that if published, the Memoirs would not just ruin Byron's reputation, which was already controversial, but would utterly devastate the living. It would expose high-ranking members of society, confirm the worst rumors of incest, and scandalize all of England. The book was a literary weapon of mass destruction, aimed directly at the heart of the moral establishment. After a fierce, panicked debate, they decided the truth was too dangerous. They placed the 4 red volumes into the fireplace. Thomas Moore, the Memoirs' owner, watched as the words Byron's final, honest, devastating self-portrait curled into black ash. The cost? Moore was paid £2,000 to authorize the destruction. He sold Byron's truth for a price, and then stood guard while the flames consumed it. The terror of Byron's lost memoirs is the terror of forbidden knowledge. It proves that the truth can be so destabilizing, so morally explosive, that society will pay any price to suppress it. The rumor of its content became even more powerful than the content itself, a permanent, dark stain on the Romantic era. We are left with only the myth of Byron, the glorious, tragic rebel, knowing that his final darkest, most human words were deliberately and meticulously erased by the very people he trusted, all in the name of propriety. The ashes of those pages still smell of scandal and betrayal. Number 3. The Saga of the Swedes, the Cannibalistic Void. We move now into the deep frozen north, where the stories are as stark and unforgiving as the landscape. Medieval Icelandic sagas are the bedrock of Norse mythology and history, filled with blood feuds, heroic feats, and moments of visceral brutality. But there are whispers of a saga so dark, so purely horrifying in its content, that it was actively scrubbed from existence, the saga fading, or sometimes referred to chillingly as the Saga of the Swedes. Unlike the political or family sagas, which dealt with property and honor, the lost saga fading reportedly dealt with something much more primal, pure, unadulterated madness driven by the brutal conditions of the early settlements. While many sagas contain violence, this one was rumored to focus entirely on extreme taboo and human degradation, particularly cannibalism and grotesque, non-heroic madness in isolation. Saga tradition was oral for centuries before being written down in the 13th and 14th centuries. Scribes and church officials often acted as editors, choosing which stories were worthy of preservation and which were too chaotic or pagan to survive. The terror embedded in the saga fading was allegedly twofold. First, the visceral content. Long, drawn-out descriptions of settlers resorting to unthinkable acts during the unforgiving winters. Acts driven not by ritualistic purpose, but by the simple, terrifying need for survival. Second, and more importantly to the Christianizing scribes, the saga reportedly contained detailed, disturbing accounts of ancient Norse rites, dark rituals, and deeply ingrained pagan practices involving human sacrifice that the Church was desperate to suppress and eradicate from the collective memory. The surviving sagas occasionally hint at this darker, excised history. References to Utlagar, outlaws, and remote mountain dwellings often carry an implied horror that goes beyond mere exile. These were the places where society broke down and where the rules of the gods themselves failed to apply. The closest we come to this terror is in the fragments of the Eyrbyggja saga, which discusses the Draugr, the undead, physical ghosts, and widespread superstition. But even that is tame compared to the rumored contents of the Swede saga. The true horror is not knowing the extent of the human capacity for evil when pushed past the point of endurance. What exact stories of depravity were so effective that they were physically removed from the libraries, pages torn out, and the manuscripts left to rot? The story of the lost saga is a haunting testament to cultural censorship. It tells us that history has a stomach, and sometimes the truth of human behavior, the total breakdown of morality under extreme duress, is simply too indigestible to be passed down. We are left with a gap in the narrative, a cold, empty silence that suggests the historical reality of life in the remote Norse settlements was far more brutal and far more terrifying than the heroics of the Eddas ever let on. This is the horror of the primal self, archived in a ghost manuscript, preserved only as a terrifying warning whispered in the long winter nights. Number 4. The original Frankenstein pages, the darker core. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, is a cornerstone of horror and science fiction. It is a brilliant philosophical examination of hubris, creation, and abandonment. We know the story. Victor Frankenstein creates his creature, is immediately horrified by it, and rejects it, leading to a cycle of vengeance and tragedy. But the version of Frankenstein that most people read, and even the original 1818 version, is a refinement. The truly terrifying, raw core of the story resides in the lost pages of the earliest drafts, particularly those overseen by her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Percy Shelley was more than just Mary's partner. He was her collaborator and initial editor, profoundly influencing the tone and philosophical depth of the work. Early drafts suggest that the relationship between Victor and his creation was far more symbiotic, and the creature's origin far less accidental than the final novel suggests. The core terror in the lost drafts lies in the ambiguity of the creation itself. In the final novel, Victor claims the creature is inherently monstrous due to his appearance. But Percy Shelley, steeped in radical philosophy and darker romantic ideas, emphasized the existential horror of Victor's total intellectual and moral failure. The creature was less a victim of prejudice and more a mirror of Victor's suppressed, violent ego. The lost sections are rumored to have contained far more explicit details about the process of gathering and animating the human parts. Mary Shelley toned down the visceral physical horror, focusing instead on the psychological. But the earliest pages supposedly contained detailed, gruesome descriptions of grave robbing, dissection, and the sheer mechanical effort required to assemble the new being elements that would have positioned the work closer to visceral body horror than philosophical tragedy. The editors of the time, including Percy, who perhaps felt the need to elevate the work's intellectual standing, encouraged Mary to excise these graphic, unsettling passages, believing they detracted from the moral lesson. But perhaps the most chilling loss concerns the ending. There are suggestions that in the initial concept, Victor did not simply die pursuing the creature, but that the lines between the creator and the created dissolved entirely. Some speculate a final twist, that the creature was Victor's subconscious, a physical manifestation of his guilt and obsession, or even that the creature successfully replaced Victor, absorbing his identity entirely and continuing his work. The final confrontation on the ice was, in the earliest conceptual stages, far more ambiguous and less conclusive. The tragedy of the lost drafts is that they represent the raw, unadulterated fear of a teenage girl grappling with the reality of creation and loss, having recently lost her own infant child. The material that was cut was the pure, unfiltered psychological reaction to generating life from death, a reaction too intense, too messy, and perhaps too emotionally terrifying to be preserved for the polite literary world of the 19th century. We are left with the polished diamond, but the discarded rough cut held the true bloody sediment of existential horror. Number 5. The Lost Library of Ashurbanipal, the Terror of Universal Loss. This section deals not with a single lost book, but the systematic erasure of a civilization's entire literary consciousness, a terrifying void that proves how easily human knowledge can be swallowed by time and violence. We travel back to ancient Mesopotamia, to the city of Nineveh, the heart of the Assyrian Empire, where King Ashurbanipal reigned in the 7th century BCE. Ashurbanipal was a terrifying contradiction, a ruthless warrior king who was also a dedicated scholar. He amassed the world's first systematically organized library, a repository of tens of thousands of clay tablets containing the sum total of Mesopotamian knowledge, history, mathematics, law, medicine, and literature. This was the first truly universal collection, dedicated to preserving every written word of the empire and its predecessors. The terror here is not the content itself, though much of it was dark and prophetic, dealing with demons, celestial judgments, and the ceaseless struggle against cosmic chaos. The terror is the violence of its destruction. In 612 BCE, Nineveh fell. A coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians besieged and utterly destroyed the city. They systematically looted, burned, and demolished the monumental structures. The library of Ashurbanipal, housed in the palace, suffered a terrifying paradox. When wooden scrolls and papyrus libraries burn, the knowledge is obliterated completely. But the Assyrian library was composed of clay tablets, fired in the hot Mesopotamian sun. When the palace burned, the intense heat of the conflagration acted like a kill, hardening the clay tablets, ironically preserving them physically, while scattering them violently. When archaeologists discovered the ruins in the 19th century, they found the library not as neat rows of books, but as a vast, dense layer of broken, mixed, and fragmented tablets, buried under tons of rubble. The knowledge was preserved, but its organization, its context, its flow, the essence of the collection, was lost. We recovered masterpieces like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first known human story, but only in fragments. For every complete tablet, there are hundreds of shards containing just 3 words, a broken line of a prophecy, or the beginning of a terrifying ritualistic incantation against the 7 evil spirits. The truly terrifying realization of the library's loss is that we know what was there, but we can only guess at how it was meant to be read. We have the pieces of a vast, terrifying puzzle, but the map is gone. Imagine having the knowledge of the human race recorded, only to have it exploded into millions of pieces, forcing future generations to piece together the meaning of civilization from scattered, often contradictory whispers. The loss of the library of Ashurbanipal is the literary apocalypse, the terror that history itself can become a shattered, incoherent narrative. It leaves us with the chilling knowledge that the foundations of human thought are built on dust and guesswork, and the vast, terrifying knowledge of an ancient empire rests forever just out of our reconstructive reach. Number 6. The second volume of Don Quixote, The Terror of Faked Identity. Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra's Don Quixote is a masterpiece, the first modern novel, funny, profound, and deeply human. But its lost, or rather stolen context, reveals a chilling terror, about authorship and identity that still haunts the literary world. Cervantes published Part 1 of Don Quixote in 1605, achieving massive instant success across Europe. However, a full decade passed before he began working seriously on Part 2. The delay was exploited by a shadowy figure who used the pseudonym Alonso Fernandez de Avellaneda. In 1614, this rival published the second volume of the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha. This unauthorized sequel was not just a piece of harmless fan fiction. It was a devastating literary act of aggression. Avellaneda's work was vicious, not just in its plot, but in its explicit attacks on Cervantes himself, mocking his age, his war injuries, and his integrity. The Avellaneda Quixote is a terrifying look into literary betrayal and the hijacking of a character's soul. In this false sequel, Quixote is not noble or melancholic. He is portrayed as a drunken, foolish clown, deliberately abused and humiliated, his adventures turning mean-spirited and grotesque. Avellaneda's version is a philosophical horror story because it strips the original character of his dignity and reduces the quest for idealism to a miserable, pitiable joke. When Cervantes discovered the existence of this counterfeit sequel, he was enraged and devastated. He rushed to complete his own, True Part 2, published in 1615, forcing him to incorporate Avellaneda's attack directly into his own narrative. In the True Part 2, Cervantes has his characters explicitly encounter the fake book, denounce it, and even have Don Quixote visit places where the fake book claimed he had been, only to declare those events lies. The terror here is the loss of the original, unadulterated trajectory of Cervantes' genius. The second volume we read is intrinsically reactive. It is a work written under duress, forced to defend its own reality against a published fraud. We will never know what the true, purely conceived Part 2 of Don Quixote would have been, how the final adventures of the knight would have unfolded had Cervantes not been forced to fight a war for his own creation's identity. The false sequel is the ghost that possesses the real one. Avellaneda's identity remains one of literature's great mysteries. Was it Lope de Vega, Cervantes' rival? Was it a group of aristocratic enemies? The anonymity itself is horrifying, demonstrating how an unknown, malicious force can fundamentally alter the course of an artistic masterpiece. Don Quixote is a triumph over the fake, but it is also a permanent scar, reminding us that even the greatest creative minds can lose control over their own creations, witnessing them corrupted and weaponized by vengeful shadows. The integrity of the masterpiece was lost forever to the terror of a published lie. Number 7. Hemingway's Briefcase, the Lost Voice of Despair. Ernest Hemingway crafted a persona of masculine stoicism, terse dialogue, and emotional control, the great white hunter, the war correspondent, the writer who knew how to capture profound emotion through minimalism. But in his earliest and perhaps most revealing writings, before he became Hemingway, a vast reservoir of his raw, unfiltered talent was lost in a moment of terrifying domestic negligence. In 1922, the 23-year-old Hemingway was living in Paris, struggling to establish himself. He had written nearly everything he considered worthwhile: short stories, poems, and his first attempt at a novel. His wife, Hadley Richardson, packed up all his manuscripts and carbons, his life's work to that point, into a small suitcase to bring them to him from Switzerland. She checked the bag on the train. When she arrived in Paris, the suitcase was gone, stolen or simply lost forever to the chaotic railway systems of post-war Europe. The horror of this loss is deeply psychological. Hadley was devastated and initially too afraid to tell Ernest. When she finally confessed, his reaction was not just anger, but a profound, career-defining grief. He described the loss as having cut off his creative arm. What was in that briefcase? It contained nearly 24 short stories that literary historians believe showed a far broader, more experimental range than the polished style he later adopted. These were the works written before the famous iceberg theory solidified his style roar, possibly more descriptive, and perhaps more deeply pessimistic about human nature than the works he permitted to survive. He tried desperately to reconstruct them from memory, but failed. He was forced to start over, reinventing his craft, refining his voice into the iconic, sparse prose we know. While this refining led to masterpieces, the lost works represent a path not taken, a voice of raw, possibly darker honesty that was edited out of existence by accident. The tragedy is that the Hemingway who wrote those lost stories was the young man before fame and trauma hardened him. They may have contained the pure, unmediated anxiety and despair that he later learned to suppress and filter through stoic characters. The Lost Briefcase represents the terror of the artist forced to kill his own past and rebuild his career on a foundation of absence. The irony is excruciating. The writer obsessed with truth and memory had the core of his youthful truth stolen by the mundane carelessness of fate. The contents of that briefcase remain a phantom limb of American literature, forever whispering what might have been his darkest, most vulnerable truths. Number 8. The Trawlerman's Manuscript, the Modern Cryptic Horror. We conclude our journey not with ancient history or 19th century scandals, but with a piece of modern digital folklore that embodies the terrifying potential for loss in the digital age. This is the story of the Trawlerman's Manuscript, a modern legend born in the depths of the internet, but rooted in the most primal maritime horror. The story surfaced in the early 2000s on niche online forums dedicated to unsettling nautical lore. It purports to be the recovered data from the laptop of a solitary deep-sea trawler who vanished somewhere in the North Atlantic. The files contained a massive, sprawling, intensely paranoid document, the manuscript written over several years, detailing not the man's physical catch, but his psychological one. The manuscript's contents are reportedly a descent into a specific waterlogged madness. It begins as a routine log, detailing coordinates, weather, and maintenance. But slowly, imperceptibly, the narrative begins to include anomalies. The trawler starts recording sounds that shouldn't exist, rhythmic knocking from below the hull in open water, the voices echoing from the static of the radio, and the slow, deliberate movement of something vast beneath, the waves that defies categorization. The true horror of the manuscript, as described by those who claim to have seen fragments of the recovered data, is its textual density and its obsessive fixation on scale. The trawler's prose becomes baroque, filling the digital pages with spiraling, recursive sentences, describing creatures of impossible size and geometry. He details a creeping structural change in the deep sea, not merely biological anomalies, but changes to the very physics of the water and the light, suggesting that the ocean is not just vast, but fundamentally wrong. The manuscript culminates in an incoherent, panicked confession that he has either been chosen or consumed by the deep. The final passages are not just prose. They are encrypted sequences, complex mathematical formulae, and geometrical sketches that seem to map a three-dimensional space that exists outside human perception. Why is this terrifyingly lost? Because it exists entirely within a disputed digital space. The complete manuscript was allegedly removed from the forums by a moderator, or perhaps deliberately corrupted by the trawler's family to preserve his privacy, or perhaps it was a brilliant collaborative piece of horror fiction, a chilling question mark about the nature of truth itself. The terror of the Trawlerman's Manuscript is that it embodies the modern anxiety of documentation. We are drowning in data, yet we can never verify its source or its completeness. The knowledge of deep, inhuman horror is tantalizingly available, but forever fragmented, hidden behind corrupt files and deleted server logs. We are left looking into the digital deep, knowing that somewhere a complete account of sanity's final moments exists, but we can only ever catch glimpses of its terrifying, distorted reflection. It is the story of modern existential horror, The truth is out there, but we can no longer distinguish the genuine madness from the fabricated nightmare, and the result is the same: a void of terrifying uncertainty.